I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a special edition of VLGA Connect. It's a live panel discussion that you'll be able to enjoy from beyond this point on our YouTube channel. And we're talking last year's floods and flood recovery, learnings, observations, what would you do different next time? And I'll introduce our panelists in just a moment. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which all of our participants are joining us today. For me, it's the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So a few words of welcome. I call on Catherine Arndt, my co-host for this event, the CEO of the VLGA. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Chris, and thank you for that introduction. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are all meeting, the various lands today. And it is terrific to be sitting in the co-host chair with you, Chris. It's, I think, the first one for this year, and we've got quite a number more lined up for the rest of the year. So you'll hear more about that at the end of today's session, but also keep an eye out in the VLGA newsletter and various social media posts. I'm very pleased that today the VLGA is hosting this discussion. It is an ongoing issue, and we'll hear more about that today from those three councils that are very much still living and breathing the aftermath of flood events. We did see some additional funds dedicated to in the federal budget to assist with flood relief, but does that go far enough, I think, to address the issues that our various municipalities and communities are facing in these flood-affected areas? I think that's the question. But really pleased to have our panel with us today, and I'll hand back over to Chris to introduce them formally. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Catherine, and we'll put that question to one side and get you to pose it as we get through the discussion today. And I just do want to mention and welcome our guests today. We have people from around Victoria joining us for the live discussion, and of course we do invite your questions and comments primarily through the chat function, if you're able to use that as we go along. And if you have a question, we will call on you in the first instance to ask that question as we get to the audience participation part of the session. So firstly, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have the Mayor of the City of Greater Shepparton, Councillor Shane Sali. Good afternoon, Shane.
It's Chris, great to be on, and look forward to chatting all things.
Thank you. Good to have you with us. The Mayor of Campaspe Shire, Councillor Rob Amos is here. Hi, Rob.
G'day, Chris. Happy to be here. It's good to be able to have this discussion.
Good to have you with us as well. And up the river to Mildura, and we have the CEO, Martin Hawson, joining us on our session this afternoon. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Chris, and apologies to our Mayor, Councillor Liam Wood, who's currently overseas at the moment. So I got the call up just lately. So thanks for the opportunity.
Not a drama at all. I'm sure you know the topic back to front, and that's a good excuse from Councillor Wood to be overseas. So I thought we might sort of take this in the direction that the waters went, and correct me if I'm wrong. So if we go sort of Shepparton, Campaspe, Mildura, Shane, can you just sort of set the scene for us a little bit back last year when you knew there was a flood event on the way, and how did you react?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So, yeah, look, obviously the biggest flood that we face in living memory here in Greater Shepparton, and as most would be aware, where we're located, obviously along the Goulburn River here, which obviously connects, from Eildon and all the way up sort of downstream, making its way to the Murray River. And along that way, all our catchments were very full at that particular point, and we had a significant rain event take place that sort of made its way sort of south and up to us in the northern part as well. So Seymour was probably the first major regional city that was impacted. And we probably had about a 48-hour time to sort of get ourselves prepared for what was coming our way. It all happened really quickly. We probably thought there was going to be a flood at some point, but, it's like anything, unfortunately, compared to, say, the likes of Mildura and Echuca, who knew there was water on the way and definitely knew there was going to be a flood at some point. Ours was based on the catchments are full. If there's a significant rain event, we're probably going to be dealt a flood event. So we had some early preparation work that was done with those in low-lying areas and obviously people that live on the river. But until an event like this happens, people don't really believe it. So there can be a number of sort of warning measures that are put in place. As I mentioned, we had sort of a good solid 48 hours notice, and we got into things straight away. There's no real handbook that tells you what you need to do under this circumstance. Every emergency situation is different, but the community rallied behind those that were going to be impacted, because with our flood event, there was a significant amount of people that were impacted, and there was also a portion of our community that weren't. No council or state government or federal government can come and do this on their own, and you need community to rally in behind you as well. And we're able to do that and harness that support that was required. Sandbag operation, ADF were here, all the support measures that were here. The flood hits, and that's when it really does become a reality for a lot of people as well. And there's always that initial comparison of what took place in 74 and 1993. And every flood event is different because we know infrastructure changes and it changes the flow of water in some ways. But this came hard and fast, and we had limited time to prepare, but we did so well in that limited time. And then the water recedes and you get into a cleanup. And from that moment to sort of where we are now, and that's probably one learning that I've got out of this, is that with this particular event, and probably like most emergencies, there's no real end date. There's that ongoing support and recovery that's long lasting as well. So although you deal with it initially and then you get through the recovery process, there's still so many people that are hurting now and requiring our support. So I'm sure we'll cover a lot more detail around what things look like through that period of time, but that's when it all took off for us in mid-October, and you know, we're still dealing with parts of it now.
And we will spend some time on what is still lingering, what still needs to be dealt with. You talk about every flood being different. This was pretty unique, was it not? I recall it's pretty rare for 3 waterways to sort of converge in the way that they did, with the water coming at Shepparton, Maribyrnong.
Yeah, so we had obviously the Goulburn River, the Broken River, and Sevens Creek, all at basically capacity as well. And as I mentioned, there was a rain event that was, you know, further south, and we know the water flows our way, and that was coming not only from Benalla, which runs along the Broken and parts of the Severn Creek as well. And then you've obviously got the Goulburn River as well, which is a significantly large river that connects, you know, a big portion of our community. Those that know our area know that Shepparton and Maribyrnong are 2 highly populated areas of Greater Shepparton, sit on the east and western side of the Goulburn River. So there was a point there where our Peter Ross Edward Causeway, so effectively the main arterial route between both cities that carries 35,000 vehicles per day, was closed for a certain point because there was some water that was over. And I think we have got some images that we might be able to have a look at some point that show that the water effectively cut off a big portion of Victoria, not only Shepparton and Maribyrnong as well. So that's our sandbag facility that was set up, and we're proud to acknowledge that we did over 230,000 sandbags over the course of about 3 or 4 days, which was an amazing community buying. You can see so many community members there.
And that sandbagging, Shane, was a totally manual operation. You didn't have fancy equipment to help with that?
No, initially. So, you know, it's the manual aspect was from the start, and then we're able to have the rapid relief team come in. I think it was on day 2 or 3, so the Saturday and Sunday, and they had the sandbagging machine, but obviously it still does require a physical component. We're going to be forever grateful of the ADF and the work they did as well by coming down and supporting us. As I mentioned, the causeway was cut off. So GV Health, so obviously the region's biggest health facility hospital here in Greater Shepparton, sits on the eastern side of the Goulburn River, but obviously you've got a significant portion of community that live on the western side of the river that need to be able to come here and service those that require that emergency support. That's the causeway there, effectively, when you come in from Shepparton into Maribyrnong. So that just gives you an idea of the water that was restricting those being able to get across the causeway. So that was a massive impact to us. That image there is effectively sitting in one of the ADF Bushmasters. So that was the only form of vehicle that was able to get across at the peak of the flood. So we were able to use them to not only take food supplies back and forth, but also get key personnel from, you know, either side of the river to be able to service our critical needs. So, you know, none bigger than the hospital. So it really exposed our region to a lot of things that perhaps we haven't seen in the past. And it's highlighted, which is a lot of our requests that are put forward to different levels of government, that, you know, modern infrastructure can avoid these circumstances, to be able to connect people from, you know, one part of your region to another that is above floodways. But under this circumstance, this shut down the Goulburn Valley really, and a big portion of Victoria. So Bushmasters were great, and they were used to, as I mentioned, food, personnel, and other forms of transportation measures. An amazing contribution from so many levels coming together to support community.
All right. I think this is one of your picks as well.
Yeah, so that there's an example. Obviously, food relief packs were collected in different parts, predominantly here in Shepparton. Fortunately, our Shepparton CBD wasn't impacted, so a lot of the food venues were able to support us in preparing those packs. That was there. I actually had an opportunity to get in the Bushmaster, so I remember that day clearly, where we were loading up the back, and then we would head across to our relief centres. So we had 2 relief centres. One was set up here in Shepparton and the other in Taktura. So we had about 800 people that required emergency relief accommodation at that period of time. And these food packages were not only going to them, but also members of our community that were effectively cut off because of the floodwater. So their properties may have been high and dry, but the connection points were cut off. So we're able to get as much as we possibly could to those people. It all happens really quick. And I did speak to you, Chris, a little bit earlier in the week, and sort of highlighted to you that proud to say we've got a really strong multicultural community here. But during this circumstance, English isn't the first language for so many. And when things happen really quickly, it's hard to get these messages out in different languages to accommodate those that have that language barrier. But community need to come together, and they did, to help pass on those messages. But that's probably one learning that we've got out of it, is how can we better connect to those that don't have English as their first language when this is moving so quickly.
Communication's an issue I'd like to come back to with the full panel in just a little while. Just before we move on to Campaspe, this is Princess Park, as I've never seen it before. Yeah, so
Princess Park, there's a levee bank. The town levee bank sort of effectively runs around that, and you'll see it sort of goes around the back portion of the oval. The Goulburn River is virtually 50 metres away from that oval. So once the water got over the levee bank, in that particular area there, it became a big lake. It was an unbelievable spectacle, and it's probably all you could do at that particular time. Once the water started to come in, it was sort of waterfalls over the levee bank, and that water lingered for quite a while, because you've obviously got to wait for the river to drop to be able to either pump it out or get through the penstock drainage system. So significant amount of work went into that facility to enable the Shepparton Swans Football Netball Club to host their first home game 2 weeks ago, which was an amazing achievement, and so great to see them be able to do that. Clearly a lot of damage to the social rooms and change rooms. So fortunate that the AFL supported us in bringing in some temporary facilities, which is great. So we were able to get them back to their home facility and reconnect the community to sport, which we all know is so important.
Thank you, Shane. That's a great scene setter. We might just take those pictures down for the moment, Belinda, and bring in Rob Amos next, the Mayor of Campaspe, for a bit of a scene setter of what happened there. So the waters, I guess you had a bit more notice that the waters were coming in Campaspe, Rob, is that correct?
Oh, sort of. Not so much on the Campaspe.
Right.
So Echuca is aptly known as Echuca, which means the meeting of the 3 rivers. So, which is really, from a normal point of time, is really lovely. But when you have the biggest flood in 150 years, and it was about 30 centimetres higher than that flood, below that flood, the 3 rivers came through. So we did have time for the Goulburn and the Murray, but the Campaspe, I think, like the Goulburn in Shepparton, came through at a very rapid rate. And we'd had the flood in 2011 in Rochester, which was pretty bad, and everyone thought, oh well, we've been through this, we can get through this again. And that flood was significantly higher than the 2011 flood.
Right.
In fact, there was a flood study done after 2011 in Rochester, and there was all these warning markers put around town that were, and people were given stuff to say how high floods would be. And those markers, the height markers that were put around town, all went underwater. So the Campaspe came up and came up through Rochester, and obviously had a devastating effect. Around 90% of our homes in Rochester had water over the floor. There was 8 hours of rescues overnight that happened there. People were waiting hours and hours and hours on their roofs and in their roofs to be rescued, and so on. And that in 2011, when the flood came through, it was only the Campaspe that flooded. So the waters came through, came to the Murray, and sort of went downstream. This time, because the Goulburn, the Murray and the Campaspe all flooded at the same time, as the water came through to Echuca, which took about 2 days more for it to come from Rochester down to Campaspe, down the Campaspe to Echuca, it flooded there, but the water couldn't go anywhere. So then it just started spreading out. So we had kilometres and kilometres outside the Campaspe River that were flooded. I think around 85% of our roads had water over them, and the last roads down the south of the Shire didn't dry out until around the end of March, early April. So pretty bad from that point of view. So then that was Campaspe, and that was hit. And Campaspe, the road between Campaspe, Rochester and Echuca was pretty much underwater for a fair while there, because that water couldn't get away. And the waters went out towards Lockington, that sort of area, and flooded all the farms out there, and then heading to the east out through Nanila and across that way. Then we knew the water was coming from Shane's part of the world, and that water, that's the water that actually floods Echuca. It comes in through the Goulburn, gets stopped at the Murray, because again it can't get into the Murray, and then it all floods and then comes from the east of Echuca and comes through. We did have that time though to do that preparation, and there was massive amounts of mitigation work, sandbags, levee walls, and so on that were built. It was interesting though, because it actually took weeks and weeks for the water to get here, and then when the peak came, it stayed for around 2 or 3 weeks, and then it took weeks to go away. So there was this very long preparation period and then a waiting period, which is really frustrating, and so on. What the mitigation work did is, when the water came up, it created a bowl inside. So Echuca effectively became a bowl, so we were holding all the water out. So that mitigation work was effective. But every time it rained, because all the drains were all blocked off, Echuca started filling up. So we had literally hundreds of pumps pumping water over the levees and over the sandbag walls into the river. And if we had more than around 2 or 3 millimetres of water an hour, our pumps couldn't keep up. A very strange and thing to do. But effectively, the mitigation works did work in Echuca, which was fantastic. It was, the fact that the water was just there for so long that was the devastating part.
We might bring up your deck of pictures to talk through. One thing you mentioned there about, the expectation of when the water was coming, etc. How was the forecasting of what to expect generally? How accurate was that information you were getting?
The Campaspe was inaccurate. We kept getting upgrades on how much water was going to come up there, and we knew. I guess the forecast said it was going to be as big or bigger than 2011, but it was significantly higher than that, and it came through so quickly. I think like the Goulburn did through Shepparton, and there was warnings and evacuation orders put out, and people perhaps didn't abide by them as well as they could have, which that's part of what happens in emergencies. I think in Echuca and our surrounding areas around there, because of that, we went a little bit. We went more than what we needed to with the mitigation around those areas to ensure that it didn't go over walls. So it didn't, as I said, it didn't go over walls in Echuca. Yeah.
So just talk us through these pictures quickly, then, Rob, if you can. This is obviously a massive community sandbagging effort.
Yep. So this is a big sandbagging effort, and so we. Across the Shire, where there's probably around 700,000 or 800,000 sandbags were filled, nearly all by the community. And what we did was with the ADF, so we had the community would fill sandbags and then go and build a sandbag wall, and perhaps not the best sandbag walls you could build. So what we did with the ADF is they're not too bad at building sandbag walls. Fancy that. So we were getting that. So we would simply they wouldn't do any of the filling, any of the carting, or anything like that. We just had them at the points that the walls were being built, and then we would have teams here filling. Then they would get on the forklifts, onto trucks. Once it got to the other end, there was more people there to deliver them to the ADF. Right, so the ADF really just were actually building the walls, which was a very effective way. And I think you'll see one of our walls later on that comes up. You talked about filling the sandbags, and it was mostly manually done. And then what we found was really effective was concrete trucks. So we would fill the concrete trucks with sand, and then they would do their spinning thing and spit the sand out. It was a great way of filling sandbags. So if anyone has floods in the future, grab your empty concrete trucks.
There's a tip. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
What are we looking at here?
This is the road. You can see the pipe down the end, see the water flowing out. So that was where we had to block all them off so the water couldn't get back in. Again, just a road that's been devastated there and collapsed and so on. So there was lots of that all along. So if you look at this is a bit rural, so you can see out to the left the water just kept going for kilometres like that. I think that's the road between Rochester and Echuca, and that's just both ways. It was just water that was probably about 1 metre deep, and the farmers had their dairy cattle walking around in sort of halfway up their legs, literally for weeks. And what was happening was the hooves of the cows were starting to get soft, and there was welfare issues with that. So there's a whole range of things that you just never think of that are problems that come up. So this is probably an after one, Disaster Recovery Australia, the volunteers who come into town, an amazing group of volunteers, very highly organised, sort of a lot of ex-military, ex-emergency services people in this organisation, plus others as well. And they did a lot of the cleanup, pulling sandbags down and sandbag walls down and just cleaning up general rubbish. There's a statistic here I've got that in Rochester there was 3,378 tonnes of flood waste received at the Rochester Emergency Transfer Station, which is equivalent to 30 years of its normal waste. This is one of these sandbag walls that the military built, so that the water was about halfway up that wall. Amazing quality walls. The stuff civilians were building were perhaps not that strong. Water would come and you'd just be constantly building them up. Once the military built these, they were not going anywhere. So that was just, the support was incredible. And to be honest, that's a civilian wall. So you can see the difference in the quality of the wall. And they all worked and so on, and it was all great. But once the military, and interesting, if you have a look at the sandbags that are used there. So we constantly were running out of sandbags. So we had Coles and Woolworths donating their shopping bags. People were using pillow slips. You can see there's produce bags there. Anything we could use to put sand in was being used as to build sandbag walls. That's the old town hall again, just incredible amount of sandbags everywhere. But as I said, the mitigation worked, but the cleanup was massive. And the other thing with sandbags, interestingly, is once flood water has touched it, it becomes contaminated waste. So you can't just take it to a tip because it's the water has flowed over land through farmer sheds and dead animals and so on. So it's actually contaminated waste. It's just not, you can't just take it to the tip. So that's our aquatic reserve that went underwater, unfortunately, that's it there, actually, with the water in it. So it became a big swimming pool. That's where we hold our major events. So the Riverboats Music Festival and so on. And it's still not in a good way. We're starting to do the repair works there. So
thank you for sharing those with us, Rob. We've learned a few things already. Concrete trucks and that contaminated waste issue was something I never would have known about. Take a breath. I want to bring in our third speaker now, Martin Hawson, who's been patiently waiting there in Mildura. Martin, it must have been a bit surreal sitting there waiting for all of this to arrive, seeing what everyone else was dealing with and knowing that you were going to have to be dealing with it in some way, shape or form at some point.
Yeah, you're right, Chris. And we were a long way down the path in terms of time, and it did feel like forever because we're seeing news reports and obviously communicating with our colleagues down south. And but it took weeks. Like, we didn't get anywhere near our peak until well into December, as far as I know. We're sort of envisaging it being in November, but it did take that time before it really peaked. There was a lot of you talked about information, and I think by the time it did get to us, the information was probably significantly more accurate. And that I think our information was relatively accurate, particularly the supplementary work from the CMA, because they do calculate. It's quite a complicated exercise where they calculate all the land impacts have happened, whether you're putting, and that's where it gets difficult over time, because you don't know how the river flows have been affected by the changes, whether that's man-made or natural. But we had a fair indication of where it was going to peak once we were probably 3 or 4 weeks out. What we didn't know specifically was that what was going to be the impact, and where the water would go where you wouldn't expect it to go, because that data just hadn't happened. So we peaked. I mean, really, it was just under 56, our 56 flood level, basically, which is the largest flood we've ever had. I think it was about 400 mil or so under that, but that's only a wave away from the peaking. So we're a little bit fortunate just with our demographics that we didn't have necessarily the impact, particularly on residential and commercial, that say the Shepparton and Echuca certainly experienced. So just through the demographics of our river, the CBD and so forth is a lot higher. So we knew that, but we did have an impact on our farming communities around Nangelock, and they were put under a lot of pressure, which is obviously produce that goes under. And then closer to town, we did have a number of properties that were basically wiped out through the flood, that it just inundated and consumed vineyards and so forth. So and that was devastating for those those particular people that were affected. And also that not knowing until it got here. We could predict it, but then you've got to apply the demographics of the certain areas. So we did have a lot of time to prepare, but a bit like Shane, when you prepare and then it hits, and then it's all, all the unexpected things that you need to be addressing was quite an experience for what we had. Fortunately, there was no, I guess, people at risk. There was no, certainly it was assets at risk, but no lives at risk, which was pleasing and enabled us to manage it. We did find ourselves building levees, and that was a major exercise for us. And this is I guess in the learning category. It's sometimes where we've got existing levees, but they're not up to speed, or you've got less than adequate engineered levees. In some ways, they become a bit of a waste of time, because a lot of effort goes into these levees. But if they're not professionally built or well engineered, they'll just wash away. And certainly there were some that was successful and some that weren't. And that's something that we learned from, that you need to just have proper levees. Otherwise, they become problematic, because they breach, the water goes past, and the water can't go back. So you're creating an issue out of that. So that's certainly a learning that we did. But we ended up building a significant levee along Flora Avenue, which is just past the main riverfront of the community. It was about 1.8 kilometres long, and quite a significant. And that was in cooperation through the SES and the other authorities involved, because we did have a landfill at risk. We did have potentially a hospital at risk, and nursing homes behind that. So I think we calculated it was something like $65 to $70 million of assets at risk, and they were significant assets, and obviously would have a big human impact. So in the space of a bit over a week, we were building levees that, like our whole capital works team were virtually just redirected to this exercise to build levees, and thousands and thousands of tons of soil and so forth, and all contractors on deck to come on board and do that. And it was a huge community effort to sort of build that levee, which did hold up. It was put under a lot of pressure, but it did hold, and that protected a lot of our residential areas to the north of our city and a northern peak. So and overall, that worked really well, and the significant cooperation. They were, by the time it got to us, I think the emergency services are a reasonably well-oiled machine, particularly by the management and what to expect, and that high-level decision-making was quite well measured. And the other thing we found that worked quite well was our level of communication. I think we learned from Campaspe and watching that coalface interaction, using the social media and so forth to really get on the front foot with communicating and that, and it was almost like you couldn't over communicate those continual messaging and giving updates. That was quite important, and I think that was well received by the community. Probably the biggest impact was on our roads that did go under, and this will be the same for others. And the residual effect, that sometimes the flood goes and the effect is still lingers because the subsurface has been compromised. And then obviously, if you open a road up too early, then particularly with weight on it, it becomes, it just disintegrates. So, and that's what we're experiencing at the moment, and that's in the recovery topic, but that's what we've found. But overall, I mean, the cooperation and generation of community support was something that really got us through the major flood of this event. And there was a high level of cooperation with the authorities. I mean, they are put under the pump significantly as far as resourcing goes, but certainly by the time it got to us, they were we did have a whole lot of, from parks to the SES to all the different authorities. There was a big injection of human resources to help us out, and that was really appreciated.
So you've actually answered a couple of questions that I was going to ask there. So that's very efficient, Martin. Catherine, you had a question?
Yeah, look, Chris, I was just going to jump in there and ask the panel, and I'll start with Martin. There's a national disaster recovery framework and also a state framework. Is it working? You've just gone through this. How's it working, and what do you think some of the opportunities are there for improvement?
In the moment, when it's all happening, for us, it was relatively organised, and they certainly, by the time it got to us, there were resources, and they had certainly the instant control of framework and so forth was well established. Leading up to it, it was a bit of a worry because obviously they had attention's been paid to those critical areas, and we understood that, but we were fortunate enough that soon as they could, they relocated the Incident Control Centre to Mildura. So we had one on site, and I think that's really important to have those people on the ground and their integration with the local authorities. So getting that right mix and participating in that, obviously, I felt that was well organised. You're always going to get that problematic stopping and starting with and continuity between decision making, because people can't be there 24/7, and so that's something that is refined, and the handover between the various incident controllers and so forth is something that, having been here for 3 of these, from 2011 to 16 to now, this was by far the best. So not perfect, but significant improvement from previous experiences in the level of communication, and the fact the utilisation of community resources as well, and knowing who to talk to and how to mobilise them. So that was quite effective. Obviously, the decision making, particularly when you're talking about millions of dollars and making critical decisions of where the resources need to be allocated, is always going to be a problematic thing, because you never have all the data that you need. You never have all the assessment and impact data that you would like to have. That was a lot more refined and a lot better. And I think from our perspective, they got it pretty right in terms of where we allocated resources and the right decisions about where to put the mitigating efforts and where to basically just, let it flood to some degree and minimise the impact on, minimise the asset impact. So from our perspective, that worked well. during the event. I think there's some learnings in their recovery side of the story, and understanding the long term, particularly when you get to economic impact and measuring that. And for us, that's where the recovery really is. It's the economic and lost, particularly commercial loss, tourism loss, all these sort of things have a flow on effect that now this is where we're at the moment. So the recovery is a lot longer than you initially thought. The event comes and goes, and it's that's where the work I think is probably an area for improvement a little bit. And then the repair in the recovery. So the whole infrastructure impact is so significant. And I know there's got to be diligence over, you know, what it was and what it needs to be, and the whole betterment argument. But that's probably where the work lies in terms of improving the framework.
Yeah, look, I wanted to ask about that as well. You know, what is the role, what role should the state government, I guess, be playing to support the local government sector through that? Are they doing enough? Do they appreciate these ongoing issues, and even the federal government in terms of some of that road and infrastructure recovery?
Well, I think they're well aware of it. It's just a question of the deployment of the resources, and a lot of it is diversion. So we basically have to stop all the capital projects and everything that have been earmarked to occur and redivert resources into doing this. So it's sort of got a flow-on effect, and the negotiation for variations and the holding up of other projects to meet this immediate need. And that's just an understanding that we're going to push out all our projects because of the impact of addressing. We virtually lost 4 months of our programs and to try and meet community needs in general. So we've got to keep that going. So anything that can happen to support that process would be welcomed. But also just the mechanics around claiming and who's responsible, and which, I guess, funding source do we access, and how do we negotiate all the different departments within that are trying to support us. That is a major issue. It has probably moved now because we've got Emergency Recovery Victoria. I think that's been a good move. But to be fair, I think though this was their first real call to action from a flood. They've sort of morphed across from fire and different other emergencies. And I think they will be better for the run, if you like, in using football balances. You know, but now their time to really lift up and come to the party with better planning, particularly in the asset when you've got a flood, because it really comes about assets and tourism, commercial flow and effect impact. The more we can get into that preparatory mode for that, the better we will be.
It's interesting, just prior to this live panel, I was in a meeting with Local Government Victoria and a number of CEOs talking about the performance management reporting framework. And of course, local government has such an integral role to play in disaster recovery, response and recovery, and yet how is that captured in that reporting framework? And there was a lot of discussion about the need to, I guess, refine and update that sort of reporting framework to reflect truly what it is that local government is dealing with every day, and in an ongoing way, in this case here with the floods. But the lack of integration was clearly something that came through in the meeting today. And and that's what I'm hearing you also say here, Martin, in the post sort of the recovery phase as well.
I think it's a little bit about role delineation. I think there's probably some efficiencies to be made just through clarifying roles, and probably the critical one is communications, and the clarity around local government's role in that. Because if you're communicating something, you've got to understand who's making the decisions. So, and communicating the decisions accurately. A lot of times there was some misinformation that sort of went out there with different different sort of authorities doing one thing and others, like the text messaging and the warnings and the not understanding the warnings and the, evacuate orders. And to be fair, it's come a long way, but I think now it's in the deployment of, okay, well, most local governments have communications and already established links with media and community engagement models. It's probably worth supporting and supplementing that work, but then getting the backup so that they can get the information, deliver it. If you've got the SES and then you've got the different communication teams all trying to communicate, the one message is key. And I think they learnt that from the pandemic, and I think that translated into the flood, but I still think there's room to move in that space to really get that local engagement with the comms far more refined, and that will help. And that's that integration. So then we're not all doing different things. Need to be doing all the one messaging and the one that's particularly in the moment when when the flood's obviously impacting.
That issue, Martin, of managing the messaging and who's responsible for what, something I've discussed with both Shane and Rob, and I know they have some thoughts. I might just come to Rob firstly, because we had a real example, didn't we, of confusion about who was responsible for certain decisions, and your mayor at the time, Chrissy Weller, was quite unfairly crucified on national television on the Today Show over that levy issue. That must have been quite demoralising to deal with in the middle of everything else that needed to be dealt with, Rob.
Yeah, it was very disappointing that they thought that was the sort of journalism they thought we needed at that time of the event, but we don't have control over that as such. From a communications, particularly with the media point of view, one of the biggest learnings I've taken out of it is, before you talk to anyone, is work out why you're talking to them. And if it's a story for a TV station or a paper in Melbourne that they want to just make some money out of, then question why you're doing that interview. Whereas if you are talking to your local paper or local, ABC Central in our case, where you can actually get information out to your people, then by all means, and so on. So that was a really big learning about was, okay, if someone wants an interview, ask the why from your point of view. And it was like, do our people get anything out of it? Does the Shire get anything out of it by doing that interview? If it's really questionable, then just don't do it.
Shane, what was your take on how the media managed and your council managed the media side of it?
Look, I guess, as I mentioned earlier, it all happened really quickly for us. And I was very fortunate that our CEO, Peter Harriott, he and I came together really well through this period of time to ensure that, as always, there's a sense of protocol that takes place in local government. But under these circumstances, things just need to be done and you need to act pretty quickly on these things. So we had the incident control centre set up here, which is obviously more that high level form of operation. And that was operating obviously 24/7. And we had council representatives in there all the time throughout that 24/7 period of time, as well as other relevant organisations and authorities. Then we also set up an emergency team here at council as well, that we're almost working 24/7 as well. So the way we structured ours is, because in some ways what Rob is saying I agree with, but any media that wanted to speak with me, I accepted it because it was an opportunity to spread the message of what we needed at that particular time. So whether it was relevant to local, state or national audience, it was an important and an opportunity for me to put that out there about what we need at this particular time. So what we set up briefings at 6 a.m, midday and 6 p.m. And the reason we did that is that every person I spoke to, whether it was local media, national or state, it was the same message. And then at 12, we would update it with numbers and so forth. And then again at 6 p.m, all that information came from the ICC into our emergency team, and that was crossed off, checked. So anytime I spoke, I was able to say, this is a decision that we're supporting as a group of councillors or as an organisation, whatever it would be. So there would never be any real mixed messaging that was coming from our organisation. That was something that we put in from the start, and we kept it going until obviously they moved on to different locations. So there was times there that it was really positive, because we had a lot of support come from outside our region that was obviously captured through that wider media audience, and then obviously from the local aspect as well. So we tried to use that to our advantage because we knew a lot of people were going to be connected to different media sources, and we wanted to take that opportunity every time it came towards us.
So just a quick reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat function, because time is getting away, as it always does. And there's a couple of key things I still want to get from the panel, if we can. One being, what are you still dealing with? What are the lingering impacts that are being a call on council resources that you might need support with, and things to remember, I guess, ahead of the next disaster, because there will be another one at some point, won't there? Who'd like to go first?
Yeah, can I jump in there? Because there is a lot, and flood recoveries are not 6-month events. They are 2 to 2.5, 3-year events. In Rochester at the moment, we still have anecdotally around 50% of our residents are still not lived back in their homes. They're still flood affected. We have around 350 that are living in caravans in their backyards. We have 150 people still living at the Elmore Field Day site, which was the temporary village that was sent up, that need to be out by August. And we don't have a final answer on what's happening there. As I said, 85% of our roads affected. As Martin was saying, these aren't just whacking a bit of gravel back on the road and grade it and roll it. You are digging them back to their bases and rebuilding them from the base up. I'm going to talk a little bit about funding and money coming through from the DRFA, which is the Disaster Recovery Funding and so on, which comes from the federal government. It gets administered by the state, by EMV. It is not quite where it needs to be, that process. We got some money pretty soon after the event, which was good, and that allowed us to do a few things. But the real main funding really only came through about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and that's not all that we need. But it was funding for things like flood recovery officers and recovery hubs. And I would argue that we needed them around 4 or 5 months ago, not last month. And the roads funding that's coming through, and we're continually needing more of that. A positive that has come out, we did have NEMA, which is the National Emergency Management Agency, and EMB and ERV, cross-border commissioners, came to Echuca 2 weeks ago and did a big round table to sit down and have a discussion about what worked and what perhaps hasn't worked as well as it should. And they did all walk away from that with, we need to go and work some of these things out. So the recovery process is a really, really tough, ongoing, lingering process that really affects people. And I don't know about Martin and Shane, but I know that 6 months in, there's stages that people go through in a flood. There is, when the flood comes, it's very frenetic, and lots of people want to get in and do things. And then it's sort of then even Christmas hit, and then there's a realisation that everything's devastated and so on. And where we are 6 months down the track is people are just starting to get really, really tired, and their resilience is waning, and frustrations are setting in, and our mental health presentations to our mental health workers is increasing at the moment. It's not decreasing.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously Rob covered it from a high level perspective, but from where we're currently sitting now, we've got about 80 different sort of community members across about 50 households still up in temporary accommodation. We had the state government here not too long ago launching a pilot program that will see forms of temporary sort of housing model. So whether it's a pod or a caravan in your existing property to keep you connected to your obviously existing environment before the flood came along. What we're sort of seeing now is clearly the issue with those that perhaps didn't have home insurance, and the funding that was available to support those is clearly not enough to rebuild your home. But I think something that is really becoming relevant now that's taking place in sort of parts of northern New South Wales is that buyback scheme. The reality is if we have another flood event that occurs that is of the same significance, we're going to have the same outcomes, really, unless you look at ways that you can minimise that risk and look at ways that you can better, remove, in a sense, the risk from community members that have been exposed to existing floods over the course of, multiple years, before this period of time. And if they're going to come as hard and fast as they did into the future, we need to be better prepared for what those environments will look like. So, yeah, right now with what we're dealing with is, as Rob said, that sort of fatigue of either living with family and friends or temporary accommodation. It's all okay at the start because you're safe and sound, but Now it's, I'm a little bit over my friend or my uncle and auntie who I'm staying with, or the hotel accommodation probably doesn't cut it now. And we're constantly working to get people back into their existing environment. But until you get into your home, it doesn't have the same effect of what it is. And those with families, obviously that's another level of challenge as well. But as for infrastructure, I need to touch on that. It really exposed us. As I mentioned to you, the bypass, I have to make a point of this. We've been advocating for over 20 years for a GV bypass that effectively starts at a higher ground in the west or east, whichever way you want to look at it. It goes across the Goulburn River and effectively connects to Shepparton as well. That would be high and dry. And we saw, as I explained to you earlier, we were cut off, not Shepparton and Mooroopna, the state of Victoria and the nation in some ways. If we had had that bypass, which is modern infrastructure above relevant flood levels, you keep that east-west connection alive. You keep people connected to your key services, which is vital through any emergency circumstance.
Shane, it's fascinating to hear that, because I can remember in my talkback radio days in Shepparton, Jeff Kennett coming on and telling me where the bypass route was going to go. And that's like nearly 25 years ago.
Yeah, I was being generous. The route hasn't changed. Just the dollar amount isn't there.
Yeah. Okay. And Martin, just a quick summation from you on where you're at right at this point of time and what you're still dealing with.
Yeah, well, we've done majority of our road assessments, but the tricky thing is we believe that the bill for us could be anything between 10 and 15 million. So that's a big gap because of the residual things that keep cropping up, and then we trace it back, and then it's obviously related to flood. So it's an ongoing scenario. So we're a bit behind everybody else in terms of their assessment, because obviously the impact is still coming through. But I do know that, probably we're a bit behind in the government flow of money. If the flow of money is probably going about as slow as the flood did coming up here, it could go a lot faster, because I know they've got to do their due diligence, and that's all appropriate and having all those things in place. But the reality is, the assessment doesn't have to be as sophisticated as what it needs to be to know that this road is going to deteriorate within the next 2 to 3 months, and it's going to be unusable unless something happens. So, and these things take time to set up. You've got to get a contractor, you've got to get it to market, you've got to, depending on an availability of people to do the work. So all these things take time. So if you're behind the 8 ball to start with, all that does is flow on. So that obviously that'll be a bigger story, I think, that'll come out in the next couple of months, particularly for all the other councils along the river or that were impacted by flood. Probably the tricky one too is still the old adage around who is responsible for levies, because the levies don't discriminate about where the land is. It could be on Crown land, it could be on parks, it could be on land managed by us, and all these difficult situations on how do you then have an overarching framework that's sort of fair for everyone of who takes responsibilities for these levies. On top of that, you have private levies that then complicate everything else, because if they're not regulated or there's not some form of sort of understanding of what the impact is, they impact on other properties and they impact on other aspects of the community, and it just becomes problematic. But then you've got the maintenance, and soon as you take responsibility, how do you maintain something that's probably only going to be used, in all intents and purposes, maybe only every 10 to 15 years, but you've got to put monies in. It's only a rabbit plague, or not even a plague. A rabbit by itself can actually destroy hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of levies that you then need to monitor and maintain. So it's not an easy one to fix, but there needs to be some collective work across all levels of government. It's probably a federal responsibility to try and get an overarching setup or agreement, and then for the state across all their departments to work out how do we move forward with that. And then we'll know from a local government sector of what role we need to play, preferably without a significant impact on the rate base, because that could be huge on top of everything else we've sort of got on our plate.
I feel like this conversation could go for hours, but we're going to have to bring it into land at some point. And there is one question I do want to ask of all of you before we do wrap up, and that is, you know, the old saying, it's an ill wind that blows no good. What positives, if anything, have come from this event? And I suspect it might be community related, but I'll ask each of you what comes to mind. Shane?
Yeah, I mean, there was multiple times where I stood back and just said, wow. I just couldn't get over how proud I was of this community that came together. As I said, a big portion of our community were impacted, but there was also a large portion that weren't. And there was just that massive community flow. One of the challenges we faced was actually being able to harness the amount of support that was wanting to come our way, like the amount of restaurants that wanted to donate food or community groups or clothing, and just being able to sort of harness that was almost a challenge in itself. So yeah, I mean, I couldn't be more proud of our community, and there was multiple times where I stood back and said, yeah, it was a really bad experience to be going through, but so much positivity came out of it at the same time.
Thanks, Shane. Rob?
Yeah, and I'll echo what Shane said there as well. So we had examples where a new sandbag wall would be going up somewhere, and the CFA would put a post up or something on their Facebook page. We need bodies to, as I was describing, to ferry those sandbags somewhere or other, and there'd be literally in 10 or 15 minutes, there'd be 200 or 300 people ready to do it. And the truck wouldn't have even turned up with the sandbags. They'd just be standing there waiting. So it was pretty incredible what the community did. The one thing, a good thing that I hope to see come out of this is the build back better or betterment, that the infrastructure when we are building it back is better than what it was. So if a road needs a bigger culvert, or it needs to be a different type of road that gets put in, or whatever that might be, and there is confusion around that at the moment. I think the federal government is very pro that, but I'm not sure how pro the state government is with that. So if we can get that sorted, we actually might be able to build our infrastructure back better than what it was. And so inevitably there will be another event, and hopefully we will have mitigation in place. And another example is the Lake Eppalock, which is what feeds the Campaspe Shire, Campaspe River, sorry. There's a study going on to see whether there can be some works done there. And that's the sort of betterment that we can see if we can have some mitigation work done on Eppalock, that when the waters come next time, it just doesn't have as serious an effect on everything.
Thanks, Rob. And Martin?
Just echoing those comments, particularly the community spirit on show in these events is obviously very important, but it's also an acknowledgement of how that community can come together. But I'd also like to highlight the cooperation level and leadership across the agencies, particularly at a local level, from the CMA, the police, the SES, both at a local and the state level. I think it was, as I said before, I think it was as good as I've seen it in terms of the phone call and the call to action and how that happened quite quickly. We had a high level of coordination, high level of communication, but also the mobilisation of resources when they were needed through the department. So I thought that was as good as I've seen it. Obviously, there's always, situations that can improve, but that was very positive. And the leadership and the response to that, we were sort of well supported in that space, and that did translate down into all the other agencies and the water authorities like Lower Murray Water, and the data we were able to get very quickly from the CMA and their mapping expertise, and that really helped us in making good decisions and supporting the emergency management teams to do what they had to do. So that was a positive for us.
So I know councils work together pretty well at the best of times around the state, particularly in regional and rural areas. Have these events brought your cohort of councils closer together, do you think? Has it prompted more collaboration and sharing of information? I'm seeing a lot of nodding.
Yeah, definitely. So we have I can see Jeff Rollinson there from Gannawarra. We have the Murray River group of councils, which is from sort of Moira Shire up to Mildura, including Loddon as well, and so on. And there's been so much work post the flood together to work out what each one needs, sharing of information, but even sharing of resources and so on. I know during the flood we had Mornington Peninsula sent up officers to assist us
Right.
during the actual emergency itself. As Shane said, our recovery, our emergency centre, Campaspe Shire Emergency Centre, was working 18 hours a day, and so we had people from all over the state come and help us out. But particularly in our local neighbouring shires, it's been fabulous. Actually, I've got to know them a whole lot better.
Yeah, and I'll just obviously follow on with what Rob has said there. And I think, I'm proud to say that this council has in the past and will always continue to support neighbouring municipalities. And we did that with municipalities that technically aren't next door, but a little bit further away, that faced the bushfire emergency a little while ago as well. So definitely, we'll always offer that support, and we had it given to us through this event here. But what we're really starting to do now with the form of collaboration with some neighbouring municipalities is our recovery around the tourism side of things as well. So we know we often all have a real overlap of visitation, especially, Campaspe, Mitchell, Strathbogie and Moira Shire in particular, where we're located. So, we want to be able to make sure that when people come to our part of the world here, that they experience some really good things in Echuca, have a great time in Shepparton, and perhaps on the way back to the city, stopping at Nagami and get something to eat as well. So it's that overflow collaboration that we're working through now. And
a final thought on that, Martin?
Yeah, I think behind the scenes too, the resource sharing in terms of personnel, and it comes in different forms. I mean, health officers are scarce at the best of times, but the willingness, we sent some health officers down south, and that's always well received when they come back up here. So probably the nature of the flood moving a bit slow enabled that to happen a bit more smoothly than normally. It's a fire and it's a midnight phone call, but this was a little bit better to organise. And we also had our emergency staff work out of Swan Hill for, I think, must have been 2 or 3 months overall, up and back the highway. So it gave us a good insight into what was coming as well. So it did work both ways. So that skill sharing is always, always on the cards, and is well supported to the extent of infrastructure support in terms of graders and trucks if needs be. So that's always welcomed when we can do that, and there's a really good spirit of cooperation particularly along the river trail.
That's terrific, and a great takeaway. Now, just before I come to Catherine to wrap up, I do want to put each of you on the spot with one quick question. What would you do different next time?
Oh, look, I'm not sure. Look, there's always things you can do. Could we have communicated better? Could we have gone and seen that community a bit more than perhaps what we did? There will always be a lot of learnings along the way. They're a tough thing to go through, and I've actually found myself thinking about the Black Summer fires down on the other side of the state, the councils down there must have been going through at that time, and you do feel a little out of control, and it's that they're a tough thing to go through, and they can continue to be.
Shane?
Yeah, I think obviously what Rob mentioned there as well. Look, there's so many things that we did so well, and I'm proud to say we did them well, and then there's so many parts as well that we can have a sense of improvement. But I remember fondly going through this period. I'm married with 3 young kids, and one thing I'd probably do differently is not tell my wife that it'll be over in a couple of nights.
Okay. Yes, don't get ahead of yourself, in other words. And Martin?
I think the one learning I got was probably trust the data earlier on. You get this data put on your desk and it says, well, this is what's going to happen. And you go, is that really going to happen? And if that is, but if anything, the data was accurate, and it was, from our perspective, particularly our local CMA stuff, and it virtually predicted it to, within half a metre of what was actually going to happen. And you're often making big decisions on that information, but I got a lot of confidence out that. So I'd be, and that enables you to make decisions earlier on, and then be more prepared for what's got to happen in mobilising resources and so forth, but also lobbying for funding as well. When you've got accurate data, you're able to say, this is going to happen, and we need to divert or do whatever. So I'd have some more confidence in the data that's now available, and presumably it's only going to improve. So that was a big takeaway for me.
Thank you. Now, right at the last, we've got an audience member with a hand up with, is it a question? Is it Anna? If it's a quick one, we might be able to squeeze it in.
Thank you. That will be great. I'm sorry I missed most of this. I had difficulty with my emails. Now, I would just like to comment that in Carisbrook, we experience a flash flood. So we're not actually a flood zone, but we're a flash flooding zone. So in that sense, the experience was that the structure that was created for the emergency services to respond, the way it was structured, did not allow for that, and was too slow. And they did not allow for the local knowledge, the people on the ground, to make the decisions and to make the calls. They had to wait for the decision to be made, or the order to come from Melbourne. So that's just my comment. So we do have different kinds of floods in an event, and I think there should be allowance for that.
Thank you, Anna, for raising that perspective, and good to have you with us. We'll take that as a comment. We're going to draw this to a close because it's been going for quite some time, and it's been very, very valuable and insightful. I'm sure the audience will agree. Catherine, some closing comments from you, please.
Thanks, Chris. And look, thank you to the panelists for sharing your stories with us. And we do wish you the very best with the ongoing recovery efforts that you're clearly still undertaking and dealing with. I guess from the VLGA's perspective, we talked a little bit about the sharing of resources and councils from neighbouring and even far away municipalities sending in assistance. As a non-government organisation, of course, we're rather limited in what we can do to assist acute and ongoing situations like these. But what I hope that we can do by having you join us today and share your story, we can then share that more broadly with the sector and also other stakeholders so that they can hear the really important messaging that you've talked about today, and also the learnings and the opportunities for improvements in the system and the model, and also the support services and funding that are required to assist your community. So hopefully that's one thing that we can do. Really do appreciate your time and also the time of the audience, those councillors and officers who've made themselves available to attend today. I think, again, just, as testament to their the contributions that you're looking to make to your community, and also learning more about other councils and what they're going through whilst they share their experiences. Just in terms of a plug for the next live panel event that we're running, it's actually a global executive live panel discussion on the financial sustainability of councils, and we're doing that with our partner LGIU, which is a UK-based think tank, and we've got a good lineup there of some CEOs from around the world. We've got Dr. Jonathan Carr-West, who is the Managing Director of LGIU based in the UK. We have Kerry Robinson, who's the CEO of Blacktown City Council in New South Wales. And we have a local, Darren Fuzzard, who's the CEO of Mount Alexandra Shire. So if you are available next Thursday, I think the panel kicks off at 5:30? Yep, thanks for that, Chris. Chris and I will be once again in the co-host chairs, and look forward to perhaps seeing you then. And anyway, Chris, thank you so much for your fine hosting skills yet again. And I wish everyone a very pleasant rest of the day and weekend.
Thank you, Catherine. Just leaves us to thank our panel members. Shane Sali, the Mayor of Greater Shepparton. Thank you, Shane.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate you having me on.
Rob Amos, the Mayor of Campaspe Shire. Thank you, Rob.
No, thank you.
And Martin Hawson, who stepped in at the last minute pretty much as the CEO at Mildura. Thank you, Martin, very much for your contribution as well.
Thanks, Chris. Enjoyed it.
Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.